Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a really exciting show for you tonight. We have a special guest. His name is Nick Covington, and Nick is the creative director of the Human Restoration Project. And he recently wrote an article that caught our eye, and the title is Unsettling the Science of Reading: Who is Being Sold a Story? And Nick is, he has experience as a social studies teacher for 10 years. He was a teacher, high school teacher in the Iowa schools. And that's interesting, Nick, because I'm going to read something, but your articles seem to have been focused on learning to read, but your teaching experience is in high school and older kids in general. So I am going to pull something out, but I do want to bring it back to how you came to writing this, okay? So you wrote, "My goal with this piece is to capture the questions and criticisms that I have not just about the narrative of Sold a Story, but of the broader movement toward the science of reading, and bring in other evidence and perspectives that inform my own. I hope to make the case that the science of reading is not a useful label to describe the multiple goals of literacy, that investment in teacher professionalization is inoculation against being sold a story, and that the unproductive and divisive reading wars actually make it more difficult for us to think about how to cultivate literate kids." So that was a mouthful right there. And so you brought in Sold a Story, which is the Emily Hanford podcast. And you seem to say that you thought that it was divisive in some ways, or at least the message that comes across might be. And I'm interested to hear your perspective on what I just read. And also, if you can tie it in with your own experiences, since you did teach social studies high school, and right now in the work that you do, you work with middle school and high school age districts. So if I could turn it over to you, Nick.
Yeah. So, as you read, it's a little bit of a mouthful. I apologize, but just trying to get my thesis all in the first paragraph there. Yeah, I have avoided touching on anything involving reading and instruction and everything else because, frankly, I felt not that it was not my position. I didn't feel really qualified to do that. And once I started to actually dive into it, Sold a Story was actually the last line of my reading and my research into this area. And the more that I read, kind of the more that it actually unsettled for me, hence the title of it, what Sold a Story was actually about. And so, yeah, I just wanted to represent to the best of my ability the sources that I had read, the perspectives that I had on this, and how I saw it fitting into the broader case for literacy K-12 and beyond.
Okay, so Judy, you and I both read this, and I think that Nick has some very interesting ideas in here. Some I agree with, and some I strongly disagree with. And I'm interested to hear how you felt after reading this article. Since you were a reading recovery teacher, and Nick mentioned reading recovery in this article, and you have said that there were many positive things about it, yet now you feel very strongly that there are better ways to teach kids, new readers, and kids struggling in reading. So let's hear from you for a bit.
So, some context. It was Friday afternoon, and as always, Faith and I are looking for breaking news in literacy. And we saw two articles come out at the same time, and one of them was Nick's, and I was intrigued. The first thing that intrigued me was it was about literacy. It mentioned sold a story. The second thing that I found really interesting was that it was posted by Reading Recovery. Now, I thought it was well written. I thought Nick hit on many interesting points. I was happy to hear Nick talk about things that I think might be a little controversial right now, like, saying, you know what, we could be sold a story again, because, we are all using in New York City, where I work, research-based curriculum, quote unquote evidence-based. But like, Faith, I've been telling you for a long time, not everything in that box is going to be a perfect science, right? I don't know if every task aligns with the research. However, I do strongly believe, after working in New York City schools now for 26 years, many years without a curriculum, the system failed. I saw years and years of terrible data in New York City, particularly, and I know all around the country because I actually live in Greenwich, work with students in Greenwich, Connecticut, work in New York City, speak to parents all over. Our system has been failing the kids, okay? And I worked in many schools that had zero curriculum. I was Reading Recovery, then there was like sprinkles of Lucy in some schools, and then there was some schools that had zero curriculum. And I work in many schools that have really poor kids, and it really frustrated me for a really long time that these kids weren't getting a research and evidence-based chance at success. Now, in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I live, a lot of these kids weren't either at some point, but they had me after school, right? I was tutoring 3 kids, 4 kids, 5 kids.
But not all of Greenwich. They all don't have you. So let's turn back to Nick. All right. So you just heard from June.
Oh, wait, one thing.
Wait. Let me just.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay. So she mentioned working in New York City. She was a Reading Recovery teacher, and she feels that after seeing, how kids are struggling, that there is a better way. Your thoughts, Nick, and then I want to comment about Reading Recovery as well.
Then I want to go back to mentioning the word decoding.
Okay, let's hear from Nick.
Okay, let's do it.
So for context, right? So if people haven't read the piece, they can just go to humanrestorationproject.org. They can go to our writing page, or post it. Yes. So for some context there, the way that I mentioned Reading Recovery actually came to me from Tim Shanahan. So, he is somebody that I had actually heard in literacy spheres, well beyond. So to find, his work now as I was approaching this piece, I thought was really interesting. And the only time that I really mentioned Reading Recovery is through his lens, to say, there's a lot about the learning and the mind and memory that we actually don't know, to have some humility around that. And he says that Reading Recovery, I guess I can just quote from him indirectly. He says, somehow students who are being taught in this way are still ending up reading much as the kids who receive explicit decoding instruction. The same could be said of approaches to reading that only teach words. As already noted, such approaches like Reading Recovery do not do as well as explicit decoding instruction in improving reading. Yet, how do students learn from them at all? According to basic research studies, they should not work. That they do should be a matter of more than intellectual curiosity.
So Nick, I'm going to jump in. So I read the article and I saw what Tim said, but there was a study that came out in 2023 that talked about that over years, right? That these kids, when they move into 3rd grade and 4th grade, not only do they lose what was taught, but they actually are those kids who have regressed more. They are harder to teach. And I could vouch for that. I have had those Reading Recovery kids, my whole career in tutoring, working with kids where Reading Recovery did not work for them, and their parents were calling me after they hit 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade. So there are, and I respect Tim's work, but there are studies that show that it over the long haul, that it did lose ground. Also, I just want to mention the studies. There were only 3 out of 202 studies that met the standards of high quality evidence for Reading Recovery. And they were small scale studies, only 105 participants. And none of those until 2023 really had data that tracked the long-term impacts. So I know, Judy, you're like, but you can't wait to say something. So jump in.
You said I'm interrupting, so I'm sitting. I'm drinking seltzer.
Oh, I didn't know drinks were involved. I just got tea in my cup
Oh,
over
well, you
here.
know
Come
what?
Well,
We
on.
actually, every time Lucy Calkins is mentioned, we usually drink to Lucy. And, you know, Judy, you mentioned her before.
Did Nick mention her in the article?
No.
Isn't that a miracle?
Yeah, well, I think for some context, I mean, I'm not taking a side that says I'm pro reading recovery, anti-reading recovery, or whatever in there.
That's how I took it. That's
yeah,
how I took it, Nick.
So
Yeah,
that's
I think,
if you're
yeah.
expecting me to mount a defense of reading recovery, I'm not
No,
not that
no,
person. So
we're having a conversation, and
yeah,
actually, I think what really did come across to both of us, Judy, I hope I can speak for you. I think that—
Why not? I'm going to drink some more seltzer.
Yeah, it was well written, very well.
Thank you.
Very well written.
And
Thank you.
even like I said, even though I don't agree with you on a lot of points, I thought that you did come up with some very good points that I'd like to highlight as well. Judy, did you have anything else you wanted to say about reading recovery before we move on?
I don't think I wanted to say a lot about reading recovery, but I think part of why I am good at what I do and have great results is because, you know, I never just followed reading recovery. I knew that a lot of the kids that I work with didn't do as well as they should have. 40% of kids will I think the data says that like 40% of kids in the classroom will do well no matter what.
Right.
But then there's 60% of kids that really, really will do better with explicit instruction. And I think the proof is in the pudding for me, because, you know, I saw a lot of kids didn't learn how to decode well with me when I was a reading recovery teacher, because I wasn't given the skills and the training to know how to teach kids how to decode well. So my flaw as an educator was that, you know, I was getting kids ready for the first letter, maybe talking a little bit about silent E, but there was no scope and sequence to follow. I wasn't teaching kids how to make the sounds well enough. We were told not to tell kids to sound things out, where we know now the research says sounding it out is very beneficial for many kids. But at the same token, I do go back to many things that I did learn in reading recovery. Like after we were very well trained in like what Tim Rasinski always speaks about, phrasing and fluency. So after a kid reads a sentence with me, even in the early stages with a decodable, they sound choppy. I don't really want them to sound choppy. I still go back to what I used to do, which is, okay, let's read it together. Or let's read it quarterly, or let's echo read that sentence. There was nothing wrong with that.
So Nick, again, you're not saying you defend reading recovery, and that's not your thing. So let's move on. You also mentioned in the article that, you know, England was using and still uses synthetic phonics. And you said that the data is not very good in terms of what it was showing, where they went into a more phonics approach. However, I want to bring something up to you. You were talking about the PISA results, right?
Right.
But in May of 2023, the PEARLS study, Progress International Reading Literacy Study, the PEARLS, England came out with a press release, and they were 4th internationally. So they were 4th out of 43 countries, Nick. And, I'm really not understanding how they could come out 4th, where they've been doing synthetic phonics for years. It was like the national requirement to use synthetic phonics. Their results were moving up from 2011 to 2016. And they, through the pandemic, they did not lose any ground where other countries did. So could you speak to that?
Yeah. So again, for context for listeners, viewers, or whatever. So what I found, and I mean, when I read it, I thought it was a pretty shocking study, was this big meta-analysis that they did of PISA studies comparing the system of phonics in England to other systems around it. And this study came out in 2021. So yes, the Pearls study from 2023, not something that I looked at there. And what that study found that I quoted in the piece, this wasn't research that I did on my own, but the study that I quoted in the piece actually said that they found that England had been less successful. This was in 2021, obviously, since the introduction of more emphasis on synthetic phonics. And the thing that I found compelling, though, was this idea that perhaps this emphasis on phonics had actually gone overboard in the sense that it had encroached in earlier and later years, where then it starts to overtake other literacy skills like building background knowledge that become important as kids get older. And I thought that was an interesting part of the piece to say that, in the context of literacy, which is eventually where this thing moves, we have to think of early reading and whatever we want to call the science of reading in the context of actually how it helps make literate kids. And I think there can be, and I cited again in the piece, a lot of instances where I think an oversimplification or perhaps an overzealousness around certain parts of a science of reading actually end up getting in the way of other parts that might help build literacy in the future too. So that piece was just kind of jarring to me because it was a systemic level. And to get a little bit further into that, because in my own piece, I used it just as a bridge to kind of build into some solutions. The things that they recommend and the way that the policy, or I guess the way that educators in England felt with these changes was really that they had been steamrolled by Ofsted, and you can read horror stories about the Office of Education over there in England and the evaluation system and everything else. But, they said that, classroom teachers using their professional judgment to ensure the coherence of teaching phonics and reading with other relevant teaching is most likely to be effective. I feel like that just kind of makes sense based on the data, makes kind of intuitive sense to me as a secondary educator. And then they say that these scripted lessons, the insistence on these inflexible approaches are unlikely to be optimal, and that well-trained assistants working in collaboration with their teachers could be a very important contribution. So to me, they saw it from a holistic lens rather than just this small change in teaching synthetic phonics as a pedagogical approach as opposed to other approaches to reading, and looking at how all those wraparound things that we do with schools actually help build literacy.
So just for people listening, synthetic phonics, it is just what the name implies, to synthesize. It goes from sounds to the whole word, right? So say the sounds and read the word, and it's a print to speech methodology. It starts with print, all right? And they learn the letters and what the sounds are that go with those letters, and then they put them together to sound out to read the word. That is synthetic phonics. And that's what they use in England. And I just want to talk about the importance of understanding how it is supposed to be the primary way for kids to learn how to read. So I want to just specify that this is for young children. And if it's done well, the idea is get in, get out, move on. It's not supposed to be phonics in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, high school. If it's done well, it's supposed to be something that is short term, hence the phonics check, to make sure that kids are, in fact, able to sound out words. And they use a nonsense word assessment because this way you could really see if they can apply their decoding. And we know that multisyllable words are made up often of syllables that are nonsense syllables. So if they can do that in isolation, then hopefully they would be able to read bigger words. Judy, your thoughts, obviously you can't speak to synthetic phonics, but just the importance of a phonics approach in K-2, and how even though we know about all the components, as Nick said, we can't just talk about phonics in isolation. the science of reading is about all the components, and that's what science of reading advocates have been saying all along. What are your thoughts, Judy?
So I think Nick is fun. I gotta be honest with you, Nick. It's something we've been talking about episode after episode. I think about what does that literacy block look like? And it's not just the 30 minutes of phonics. It's not just the 10 minutes of potentially Haggerty or phonemic awareness instruction. What does that entire literacy block look like? And, skills taught in isolation also don't mean that it's going to transfer into decodable text or into authentic text. That takes a lot of work. So, even after this podcast tonight, I owe my principal an email. I texted him an email, and then I'm going to send him an email proposing certain things in the literacy block, because research also says the application piece of putting things to work is so critical. You could see something in phonics, but have no idea that that's actually happening in a real book. And that's critical. Now, I also think Nick is spot on with knowledge building. And a lot of these curriculums, some schools chose HMH, some schools chose wit and wisdom, some schools taught expeditionary learning. We can't just think because it has that SOR label that they all do an equally wonderful job at building knowledge, right? So that does still take teacher input. I tell my teachers, okay, you don't feel like it's doing enough? Are you showing those videos about the Statue of Liberty? Are you maybe scheduling a trip to the Statue of Liberty? So I think Nick is spot on in that sense that, yes, even if something comes in a box, we can't miss this golden opportunity to get it right this time. So I appreciate it. I really do. I think it was refreshing. And one thing about the literacy view is, we don't want to always agree with the people that we speak to. I think the way we push the needle and really shift the thinking is having these discussions and saying, yeah, I agree with this, but I don't agree with that. And I appreciate, Faith and Nick, talking about different studies and talking about it in a way that's healthy. This is awesome. This is great. This is the best part of my Sunday night so far, Faith.
Yeah. No, I would agree. And I would agree with Judy that I think what really stood out to me, Nick, was how you talked about the importance of teacher responsibility, teacher knowledge, not just turning it over to a program. And that I feel very strongly about that. Both of us, Judy and I was a regional coach for Reading First, and I would like to talk a little bit about Reading First, but that's after. But in any case, I did coach. I am a consultant, and I constantly coach teachers now, and with embedded training and sharing my knowledge and hopefully imparting what I've learned throughout the years. So I do really understand what you were saying, Nick, about the importance of teacher support, teacher responsibility, and that we can't just ignore the teacher in the equation. Do you have anything that you want to add just to that point, Nick, before I go on to something else?
Well, I can maybe get, can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. I think this is the part where I feel a little bit more confident because it shifts more into my wheelhouse. If you notice in the piece, there's really kind of like three parts, right? There's okay, let's kind of address the science of reading part of things. And obviously, as sort of an outsider novice in this, there's not a whole lot that I can disagree with as far as science of reading goes, right? I feel like that's the domain of researchers. That's the domain of all of these things. So the science of reading, I don't have a beef with phonics. I don't have a beef with this. 3Qing just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, as a parent, as a whatever. So I'm not going to go to bat for anybody in that regard. There's the second part of this, though, where I think then we start to get into bigger conversations, which is the uppercase. And you'll notice in the piece, I always call it the science of reading in these big scare quotes, right? To distinguish it from what the research actually says. Because as we move from what the research says into implementation and into movement building around the science of reading, I think that's where then we can actually have a dialogue and a conversation about that, because then that gets in the realm of policy making. And of course, for public schools, we all have a say and a stake in what those things look like. And then, through my humanities lens, that's primarily how I see the world anyway. So if we are to be able to have functioning small d democratic school system, this is the part that we should care about the most, right? What is the shape of these movements and how are they being implemented in schools with fidelity to the science, right? Where we can defer to the authority, the domain, right, of scientific research, and then the times where we're going to have to look elsewhere for those answers, right, where we're not going to be able to look at what a science of reading says about decoding or phonemic awareness or all the other parts of things, right? And we have to ask, right, well, what are the policies that are going to shape what curriculum is purchased? How is that used? How are our teachers trained? And that's obviously in the work that you do there too. But in the second half of the piece is really where I think I start to get more into my wheelhouse and breathe a sigh of relief, because I think that making that shift from the science into the implementation, into the policy realm, into the shape of schools is a place where I feel more comfortable talking about.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there really are two different things here. There's what you would call the science of reading, which
Right.
is, and as you said, scientists don't even use that term. But there's also what we call SOR instruction, right? And I think those are two very different things, even though people talk about them as one. Just having the research and then looking at the instruction are really two separate pieces. And it's something that we really need to look at in a deeper way. You mentioned in your article reading first. So
I knew it was coming. I knew it.
Well,
You're bringing us back to the reading first. Okay, that's all right.
Have to
It's your
go
show.
back to reading first because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings around reading first. Having done the work and having been part of that, so anyone out there who doesn't know about reading first, this was an initiative that started way back when No Child Left Behind was initiated in the Bush administration. And then there was this government initiative, federally funded, to get any low performing school districts up to be able to read by grade 3. That's all I'm going to say about it. So anyhow, as somebody who was a regional reading coach for Reading First, going into multiple districts, low performing school districts that qualified, all I could say is that information that people think that Reading First did not work. Well, Reading First was not always implemented the way it was supposed to. And even though the science was there, people were still holding on to what they did. And then there was, you had mixed methods going on where they were getting one thing, but still doing something that wasn't. They were taking money from the government that supported it, but then they weren't really doing what they were supposed to. So it really wasn't accurate in terms of what ended up coming out of that. And I know that's not your wheelhouse, as you said, but you did write about it. And I think it's important to address, because I don't think we want to leave people with misunderstandings about certain things. And I could speak from personal experience from what I saw with my own eyes. So I had to put that in. Your thoughts, Nick?
Yeah. So again, the context that I cite in here is from 2008 or 2009 study. I don't have it right in front of me, but essentially they looked at I think the first wave, and my understanding too is perhaps the second wave was more successful. Could that have been due to tighter regulations and a better administration of the funds? That could be the case. But at least that first wave, and it's like a 211-page report that I had to try and figure things out. What I was actually shocked to see is that they found, on average, the estimated impacts on student reading test scores were not statistically significant. And that really bothered me, because the outcomes also stated that teacher understanding and knowledge of explicit instruction and phonics training, all the things we would expect early literacy teachers to understand, increased. But yet that didn't translate into an increase into reading comprehension. And so that's the part where I thought there was this interesting disconnect. And I think I added on to that a little bit too, in the sense that I think those policy requirements as part of the bigger umbrella, No Child Left Behind, had a detrimental impact. I mentioned this Navajo school, which comes out of this really interesting study of the impact of No Child Left Behind on, the indigenous reservation schools, because oftentimes my understanding is that this money for these programs was attached to English only instruction and English only for these materials and everything else. And so they lost a lot of the culturally responsive practices that they were using that supported, say, the Navajo community, Navajo language, all the other, parts that go into reservation schools, Native American schools, et cetera. And actually found that post making that shift to English only reading instruction curriculum, that their scores dropped by 50%. So there's a dramatic decline of losing. I'm not saying this is the fault of phonics, right? But I'm saying of losing a culturally responsive approach to get right a reading package or something that's attached to some amount of government money ended up costing a lot more in the long run for these marginalized groups, right?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Of course.
I have very strong feelings on all of this.
Yeah.
So one thing I do want to say is I think the way I took it, that your point was basically that implementation is such an important factor. And, maybe reading first, like Faith has more experience with it, although I was teaching at that time, but maybe it failed because of implementation. And I know right after reading first, very soon after came reading recovery training. I was trained by the government as well. I was trained.
What I'm saying is it did not fail the way it seems.
No, right.
But maybe it didn't. Actually, there were gains, and the message seemed to imply that it wasn't going anywhere, but the funds were also pulled prematurely from that.
Well, that's part of all part of the implementation process, right? That's all part of it. It all ties together. And that's, that's part of the problem. And then very soon after that, I was trained in reading recovery. It was also a government grant. So it's interesting how we went from a very structured approach to balanced literacy. I did that role for 4 years. Then the research and data was saying that wasn't going very far. Now we're going more towards a structured approach, which I believe in, like to the core of my soul and essence, right? But if we don't think about implementation and what that looks like, we could very well fail again. And I think that, Nick made a point with letters training, right? I'm in letters training. I can't wait to finish it. I know everybody on the internet is like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. For me, it's okay because I've had a lot of this knowledge before. It's very, it's long. There's a lot, it's very time consuming, but, it's a lot of theory, right? But a lot of the things that really push change is coaching, modeling, seeing what happens. And you know what? I missed it in the last episode because I didn't want to talk a lot about it because I still do work in the New York City schools, but I was a coach for Central and I was cut. Mm-hmm. So now I had to take a job in-house in a building where I'm very loved and very appreciated and think I'm, really supporting my teachers with helping them learn about the science. But not everybody has a little Judy that's cheering them on and talking about the science. So, just watching a computer that's teaching you about the brain is not what's going to it's helpful, but it's not the end all be all in making change happen.
Yep. So now, Nick, Judy brought up a good point, and you mentioned this in the article with letters training, that you cited that it doesn't really translate to student outcomes, even though the teachers are gaining this overall knowledge. And from my understanding, and from what I think Judy's saying, that unless it's tied to a curriculum, unless something is tied to materials and training and coaching that's tied to some sort of curriculum, it doesn't translate to student outcomes. Your thoughts, Nick?
So the study was citing that the thing that shocked me here, right, was the fact that the sample size was huge, 90 schools, 24,000 students, I think 270 teachers, and these teachers got 8 days of letters training, which is more PD than I would get.
I'm surprised they only got 8 days, considering
okay.
I've been doing this for 2 years now, and I'm not finished.
Okay. Well, I think I don't know. I don't think the study I read cited like a timeline, or if it did, I didn't know. But it was 8 full days of training on this, which if you do 8 days times 270 people, it's like 12,000 man hours spent on this letters training, right? And yeah, it's exactly this. It improved pedagogical knowledge for teachers, but translated to no, or I guess they say it did not translate into improvements in student reading achievement as measured by standardized tests given by each district. And so again, I think I'm a huge believer, obviously, like you can't have pedagogy and no tools. And you can't have tools and no pedagogy. And it sounds like these are mismatches between each of these things. And I worry, here's what my worry, and I get to this in the piece, right, is that we are handing teachers a curriculum package and saying, teach it on the one hand, and they don't have background, or they don't have support, or they're dealing with, putting out other fires and running around like their hair is on fire because it's school. Or right on the I think I would err on the side of having very well-trained pedagogical teachers who can make choices about the tools they use, rather than just give uncertified, untrained, temporary, whatever teachers a curriculum package from McGraw-Hill and say, okay, you are doing the science of reading, now go. Because the way I know districts work is they're less concerned about the fidelity to a science and more concerned with fidelity to the $1 million curriculum package that they just bought. So if the teacher says, I don't think it's working the way that I'm doing it, and the teacher doesn't have any skill to self-assess, self-evaluate, or make other choices or changes, they're kind of stuck, right? They're spinning their wheels.
They're
just
stuck and struggling.
before.
And
that was a good point. That was an excellent point. And that's where I think I agree with you. I agree with you that it's just this problem that it's just a different program, a different time. And you know what? I do believe in what the National Reading Panel did say are the important components of reading. I do believe in the evidence. I live it every day. And have worked and turned around struggling readers for years. But I could tell you this, that I could see the writing on the wall, that if we're just kind of choosing a program to almost school-proof, that's what it almost seems like, school-proofing by choosing a program and not investing in the teachers and supporting them, well, then they're going to turn around and say, you know what? This didn't work either. Back to the drawing board, So.
And you know what, Faith? It's really true. We see these teachers. I'm in the field every day with these teachers, and they are struggling with tasks and, making sure that it's aligned. And they are still struggling with the gradual release model and what that looks like. Now, I do wish you embraced and talked a little bit more about that, Nick. That's what I was waiting for. There is a lot of research to support that kids benefit from an explicit model and practice together before they go on to independent tasks. But I definitely think that we do need to support our teachers more. And, you mentioned in the article that, the requirements for becoming a teacher are less and less. And it's true. I see shortages in New York City for ENL and bilingual. And okay, you don't need to pass this test. And then Faith mentioned to me, she texted me breaking news the other day that, site that's this College of St. Rose is shutting down that used to train administrators. There is a real educational problem. And, we can't just assume that because a program says SOR, it's going to be perfect. We had Maureen Ruby on our show. She made us aware of that. It's just a tool, right? How long were these programs studied? Even HMH, if you go on the website on the DOE, it's there, but people aren't asking questions. People aren't doing that fact finding.
So Nick, I think that, what Judy said about a program, is absolutely true. That just because there's this SOR label, and you mentioned that in, the article, that it's way more than that. And what does that really mean? Judy and I were talking about some of the tasks that are part of these programs that aren't even doable. It's supposed to be these independent types of activities that kids are supposed to do. And we're like, I thought this is supposed to be an evidence-based program. And yet it doesn't even make sense. Like, who is approving this? Let's hear some of your last thoughts, Nick, about this. And also, I do want to go back to how you are looking at this through a high school lens, and
Sure.
that this is all about early reading instruction, young readers, teachers in the field teaching kids for the first time. And what you're seeing could be also after years, and what you're seeing that maybe is or isn't working. But let's talk a little bit about your perspective on this, because I think that's very important. Because I'm coming from a background in working in early childhood as well as elementary school. Privately, I work with people, up to college, but my training and my school experience was really up to 6th grade. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
And that's, I think, what's really interesting, right, is I make the case at the beginning that really what we were seeing for these teachers, who were really the ones who were sold the story, they were disempowered as a profession about making the best choices that they could for the kids in front of them, right? They were also told to use these curricula. They were just as much on the receiving end of publishing giants, school leaders, educational celebrities, all the things that come out in the podcast there too. And honestly, that was a critique I had of the podcast, was I felt like it was not as sympathetic to teachers as I think it should have been. But I think my biggest criticism is that there's really no sense that, so again, I say that teacher professionalization and teacher empowerment is the inoculation against being sold the story again in the future. Because if you had teachers who were teaching one way because they were told it was evidence-based and it was the thing that we're doing, well, now if they get handed a curriculum, they say, no, this is the new evidence-based one. Now teach this way. They still don't have the toolkit, right? They still don't have the way of actually understanding and knowing what is the best way to do. They're just being pulled, left and right, and are just as, I don't want to say victimized, but right, they're part of that process too. And I think, again, I use the example of teachers have been incredibly successful in organizing for learning conditions, right, for the schools and the kids in them, and the teaching conditions are learning conditions. And I think it is really troubling then that we've seen the deprofessionalization kind of replaced with, hey, we forget these teachers. We're just going to give them this science of reading package that anybody can go in and teach. And then we've seen the, as you've said, the decline of school systems, class sizes increasing, the state of school buildings is in disarray, teacher turnover is really high. And I think I even looked at one quote from the teacher quality person who said there that, like, those disruptions actually lead to achievement gaps too. So, I'm looking at all this big contradictory piles of competing narratives and stories. And really, I think I'm a person who lives in the tension, and tries to find the tension. Like I'm a materialist, in the sense that we need to attend to the conditions that we have and make the best with what we can do. But I'm also an idealist. So I want to be able to live in the best world that we can possible. And there's tension between those two things, right? How do we get there? So one of the tensions that I found was that I thought it was really difficult to look around the country and say, we care about literacy when we limit opportunities for literacy, maybe outside of an SOR curriculum, right? We remove books from libraries. We ban divisive concepts here in the state of Iowa, right? There's certain things that you can't talk about with kids in schools, books that they cannot read. I know I included a piece from Jose Luis Vilson, who's a New York City educator, who I'm a huge fan of, talking about how they cut the library hours due to budget cuts. So again, we're investing in an SOR curriculum and cutting the opportunities to build literacy outside of those things. So that was
Nick, I think New York City, I read in the paper that
Yeah.
they plan for next year to cut the budget by 500 million. Like, that's a lot of money.
Right.
That is definitely, I don't see that classrooms have everything that they need now. I could only imagine what it's going to look like with $500 million less. That's terrifying.
Right. And again, I think if we're trying to balance tools and pedagogy, or thinking about it through the lens of literacy, then cutting all those one things and then expecting the McGraw-Hill curriculum to solve it all, or whatever, the EL curriculum, or, to solve all the problems, I think is setting it up for frustration. I think it's setting up for failure. And I hope not, but like, it risks, doesn't it, a discrediting of this thing where you say, okay, we've invested all of our, we put all of our eggs in this a science of reading curriculum basket, and now we're seeing the consequences of it. Well, no, it was these other things. Actually, I think that actually risks discrediting the ideas at the heart of right, what makes a science of reading work, because we've disinvested so much. And I think, frankly, I think we see a little bit of that with the embrace of these other groups too. I mentioned Moms for Liberty. I mentioned Ryan Walters in Oklahoma. I mentioned all these other groups who are just lining up to use SOR for their own little kind of thing. And I know that that's not what the science is.
I knew you were going
I'm going to stop you there because
Okay.
a lot
Wait,
of
Faith, do
moms-
you need this?
Well, okay.
Oh, I'm getting, this is the first
Cheers.
one. I will say we're an hour in and I'm just getting it now for the first time. What is
Okay.
Still chances for cheers.
Okay. So
Yeah.
here's what I want to say.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into politics at all,
No.
but I could tell you that a lot of those moms have been
That's right.
burned badly, and
Correct.
their kids were not getting phonics. They were getting 3Qing.
Correct.
They were getting, instruction that led these kids on a bird walk. And
Correct.
so when you say that they were using the SOR for other issues, no, these are moms, some of them I know, that really spent thousands and thousands of dollars paying for evaluations,
Correct.
neuropsychology.
Yeah, and then
reports.
schools would ignore the neuropsych reports and still not give them evidence.
Ignored what they were saying. Their kids were just slipping and slipping by.
That's right.
I have to say that as far as the Emily Hanford podcast, in all fairness, because we didn't really talk about her podcast, yes, she focused on phonics because that was the missing piece for so long. So, and it was not given the attention that it should have. And it was being mixed in with a lot of other types of teaching, like leveled books and picture walks and cueing. And so I just want to say that there's a reason that she focused on that. And I don't think that was the only thing. And I could tell you from my own book, Failing Students of Failing Schools, having lived this for 37 years, I saw the damage that this has done. And I also have seen, and I could share many parents, their testimonials of how what I did with them changed their children's lives. So, I want to be very, very
And that's the
clear.
same with me. What do you think? A lot of my feelings are not just feelings. It's because of kids that are suffering, with families that are suffering. And, this is coming from somebody who's trained in reading recovery. So I really have a lot of children that I've worked with that the system failed. And I have a lot of kids that I'm working with privately that have foundations, that have Hegarty, but still have Lucy. And I have little 6 and 7 year olds telling me, Miss Judy, I'm really confused. My teacher's telling me not to sound out words, to only look at pictures. And it's still happening right now after so much research has come out. And
but that does go back to Nick's point that if teachers had a better handle on all of this, then all that confusion wouldn't really happen in the first place.
All right, so I'm going to use my cheers button.
Well, not yet. But I want to see what Nick has to say first before we
Okay.
Go ahead. I don't hear you.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Is that working now?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
I hit my mute button on accident.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm with you here. I mean, I understand the plight of people who are burned by the system, and I am not going to defend the system against people who were treated poorly by it. My son, he is on an IEP for ADHD, and I pretty much feel like undiagnosed autism along the way too. And we've had to very much work with the school district to get them to take ADHD seriously as a disability. It's
Right.
not just that he's making choices to make the teacher mad.
Right.
And that kind of thing. So I definitely feel that. I will say and instead of but or however, right? Let's make this generative conversation instead of a debate. And I think that their bigger movement, I think, at least as far as you see, attack LGBTQ identities that have led to the passages of these things, is an attack on literacy writ large, right? Like if we look outside the context of reading and writing in the early grades, Faith, you asked me to speak a little bit to my own experience for high school students,
Yes.
right? More often than not, the students that I saw struggle, I mean, looking back, I think you could probably say some of those were early reading struggles in the early grades. I mean, I can't be the oracle to go say those things, but in the work that I do in my nonprofit now, what we really see with middle school kids that the data supports, that the survey data supports, is the engagement cliff, right? So kids fall off the engagement cliff in middle school and never recover. They kind of move listless from one thing to the next, and really that is what I saw in my experience with older kids. Was not necessarily there was a lack of content or a lack of ability in reading, but there was a lack of any purpose or reason for why they should do that. And so, I kind of viewed my work as the way to get kids to connect to the world outside of school. And one of the big reasons why I walked out of classroom teaching was after, I had taught my kids about, in my AP European history class, we were learning about the history of nationalism, right, in Europe in the 1800s. And, we made connections to the history of white nationalism and where it's alive in the world today. And I got told by my principal in that conversation that, Nick, current events don't belong in history class. And after about a year and a half after going back and forth with them and kind of escalating conflicts that led to unpaid suspensions for myself and everything else, I finally resigned in 2022. So what you say with Moms for Liberty and this reactionary backlash to COVID culture wars and things, I think does have broader impacts to kids in their classroom learning beyond those early literacy grades, right? I think I'm a good teacher. I'm not teaching kids anymore, in part because of that culture war. And I think the more that it strips kids of opportunities to learn about other perspectives and opinions, then I can ultimately view that movement as harmful in the long run, right?
I'm not talking about the movement. I want to be very clear. Like I said, the literacy view is not about politics. I just want to be very clear. I am just picking out that moms with children who have any type of learning disability or dyslexia, classified with dyslexia or ADHD, that they've been burned along the way. And partly because of this whole area that Emily Hanford spotlighted, that it was, in fact, a missing component that these kids were not learning. And so,
Faith,
what was that?
also, Faith,
you're fading out. What was
you
that?
hear me? I just
Now.
want to say something too. I don't want people to walk away with a misconception that structured literacy classrooms aren't digging deep into issues also. They're really working on building knowledge and talking about world cultures and stuff like that. So I don't want people to think that, only balanced literacy talked about, different things that went on a deeper level.
Yeah, but I think what Nick said is very sad, that he could not teach about current events. And we see the problem with that today, right?
That's another episode.
That's another episode, right? But
Well, I think,
yes.
sorry, Faith, I think here is where the conversation shifts, doesn't it? From here's what a science of reading can
Right.
tell us is the best way
Right.
to acquire early literacy skills. And then where do we make the handoff into, okay, now we have to talk about policy because budget cuts are closing the library. We have a 5,000 teacher shortage throughout the state, and we're hiring uncertified substitutes to temporarily fill those gaps. And right, look at the political attacks that are preventing what our social studies teachers can teach as far as content and et cetera, et cetera. Those aren't questions we can answer with a science of reading, right? So what the point I'm making in the piece is, what do we use to answer those questions? What is the toolkit that we have to help us answer them? Or is it just going to be filled by these groups who are going to fill it with their own ideas and ideas? It's one thing, Faith, I totally understand, is not want to talk about politics, but anytime that we're talking about policy implementation, we are, in a sense, we don't have to be talking about partisanship. We are talking about the exercise of power, right? And these groups are exercising power in a lot of these different ways. And I think we need to be hip to the reality of that, right? We need to be cued in.
Okay, but here's how I.
All right, I'm going to take some seltzer while you guys keep going at it.
Well,
grab another one.
But I'm more concerned.
Actually, Nick, let me just tell you,
wait a minute. I'm more concerned with special interest groups that protect publishing companies, and that's more of a problem for me, which is all about the money.
Correct. I'm with Faith.
And, and they kind of move us in the direction, like Heinemann, into believing that, they had all the answers and that basically these school districts were spending bang, on all.
Correct.
So,
but Faith, that Heinemann is part of some of the new programs out there. You know that, right?
Yes. Yeah. So HMH, I think, and Heinemann are kind of together. So there's so much that we don't see and so much that's not really being talked about that, yes, you could focus on a mom group, but from my perspective, those moms, I don't, in my mind, any mom who has been fighting this fight,
or dad,
mom or dad or guardian, whatever, has been fighting this fight for so long. I have the utmost respect for,
and as I do as well.
And I sympathize with them. What I don't sympathize with are, these special interest groups. I don't sympathize with professors who have tenure, who know better and continue to peddle this garbage. And that really bothers me as well, Nick. I don't know how you feel about that, but, to me, that's a sin. That's a sin that they're training teachers and they're responsible for moving this forward. And that's why this hasn't gone away.
Well, this is what I say in the piece, right? I say, meet the old boss, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right?
I love when you said that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's what it reminded me of.
I'm going to do cheers.
That's a cheers.
Okay. Maybe that cancels out my BS button from earlier, but that's again how I felt about teachers in this. The teachers are the ones that are being sold a story from the curriculum companies and stuff. And I think, honestly, these companies, not just McGraw-Hill or Heinemann, but groups like the College Board, too, play a really outsized role in influencing what education across this country, looks like. And again, dang it, I don't want to get political with you here, Faith.
Yeah, please don't do it.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I was gonna talk about the curriculum. Well, so again, this is I think a difference in lenses, right? So when I think of it, I don't think of it in terms of partisanship. I'm thinking of it in terms of policy and power and who has it and kind of the flows of these things. And again, that's a theme in my piece too, isn't it? It's questions of language are questions of power. That's something that Noam Chomsky said. So I think anytime that we're talking about policy and implementation, we have to be talking about power and politics. It's not partisanship.
But
it's the reality.
Nick, there's also power in curriculum. And I know you mentioned social justice, and I've been in schools where there were teachers writing a curriculum, and it was social justice curriculums, and the teachers were writing it, and there were many great lessons, but we had data that the kids couldn't read. So was that fully, helping social justice policy?
Well, I mean, I can't answer. I can't answer for this, this, that, or the other thing. But I think I will speak. I'll bring it back to the culturally responsive practices part, right? Another example I bring in up in the piece is Houston ISD. And if you've been following the news there, basically, right, the governor appointed the TEA person, Texas Education Agency. They appointed a new superintendent at Houston ISD, Mike Miles, gone in and made a whole slew of changes, right? And one of those changes is implementing the science of reading curriculum, again, in English only. And Houston is a district that is, overwhelmingly Hispanic, Latino. I think something about 46% in there are Spanish speaking. And I had already talked to a parent in Houston for our podcast who said there already are concerns about how the rollout and changes are going, being communicated in Spanish for those families. And now there's double concerns, right, that their kids are not going to be getting the same kind of multilingual instruction and support that they did before.
That's another topic we're definitely going to address on the literacy view.
Yes.
I see a lot of that in schools, and I could talk about a lot about that on another episode. But yeah,
so
there are in that realm.
I just think there's a distinction between like social justice being like, we're just, I don't even know, it's a caricature of what social justice is, and then really fitting it into more responsive frameworks, culturally responsive frameworks, in terms of meeting kids where they're at with cultural capital, meeting kids where they're at in terms of language, community supports, and all those other things that we know, right, are going to work in those, and not just,
I agree with you, Nick. It is a bigger conversation. It is a bigger conversation than just science of reading.
Yeah, sorry.
It is. I think just when people walk away, and hopefully they will read your article, from what I got out of it in terms of where I did agree with you, is this importance in terms of getting teachers up to speed so that these things just don't keep happening, where history doesn't keep repeating itself, where they need to kind of know what's going on rather than having the publishers tell them, here it is, drop it in their laps. Now just teach this, and not really think of the bigger picture in this. So I'd like to wrap up. If there's anything that I didn't mention, Nick, please, just say it now, and then we'll wrap up.
Hold your peace.
Yeah, right.
Yes. Well, I think, again, I'll encourage people to read the piece, but I'll end too just by referencing someone whose work that I found particularly informative on this, and that was Maren Ackerman. That was not someone that I was familiar with before encountering this work, but I found her words kind of a refreshing sort of antidote to, a lot of the heat that gets generated as a result of this conversation, especially as we had just kind of experienced, like, how do we fit, a socially just science of reading into this? Aren't these kind of at loggerheads? And they wrote this wonderful piece, her and another co-author, dang it, let me pull it up here, Lorian Schultz. It's towards a robust and socially just science of reading, which I really think meshes with a lot of what we had just said here, as far as teachers having access to literacy curricula that supports varied aspects of textual dexterity, attends to students' literate dispositions, cultivates their development as literate individuals, honors their differences. It teaches for decoding, supports comprehension, different kinds of text use, critical thinking about text. And they say that reimagining a science of reading based on these principles, attending closely to linguistic, cultural, and individual variation, et cetera, has the potential to make it, the science of reading, both a more robust and more socially just, particularly for kids from non-dominant cultures. And so I just think, I hope with my piece, we can generate more light than heat, and and really just kind of find a way to dial down, I guess, these reading wars, and understand that none of this is a call against reading. It's a call for more literacy overall. And I'm excited to bring that conversation here. And I just thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us, Nick. I think, like Judy said before, we really try very hard to bring people on with different perspectives, because, otherwise we're living in an echo chamber. And I thank you for the conversation, for spending your Sunday evening with us. Judy, I'm going to turn it over to you. So tell everyone how they can get in touch with us.
So just remember, after watching this episode, we have a unique opportunity to make a difference in the lives of so many kids. So keep on pushing those questions, ask questions, and here's where you could find us. You could find us on Facebook, The Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Follow us on Instagram, The Literacy View. Follow Faith on Instagram at High Five Literacy. Follow me on Instagram at Boxner Judy. Follow us on YouTube. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you could be the first to see when something comes out. Also, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We want to see more reviews. We want to hear from you more. Please subscribe.
Yeah.
And share your thoughts.
And share the podcast, please.
Right.
We appreciate it. Share it with your friend. So, okay, let's wrap up, and good night, Nick. Thank you again.
Of course.